Let's talk to some real people, unlike Chris Bryant, shall we? It is time for Barrage the Farage, that part of the show where I get questions thrown at me. I do not know what they are before they're asked. Steve, you're first up, mate.
Good evening, Nigel.
Good evening.
My question is, how can forgotten manufacturing towns like Dudley, Bilston and Albury bring factories and jobs back from China?
Well, you're quite right. Or, as a friend of mine says, China. You're right. I mean, the West Midlands has completely lost its manufacturing base. Now, we know through time that industries evolve and change and there are cheaper cost bases in other parts of the world. We get that. However, what we have done is to disadvantage British manufacturers, energy, with heavy engineering, with many of those smelting, many of those activities. Heavy engineering needs a lot of energy. Our energy bills are 50% more than America, 30% plus more than they are with our next door neighbours in France. We've disadvantaged British manufacturing. And because Boris is so proud, we've reduced our CO2 emissions more than any other Western country. Yes, by outsourcing manufacturing to India, China, other parts of the world, and then importing the goods back. I can't wave a magic wand and tell you that overnight manufacturing will come back. But I can say two things to you. Number one, that we have to be self-sufficient in energy. We should be an exporter of energy, not an importer of energy, and make sure we can provide industries with energy at good competitive prices. And secondly, end this obsession with sending as many kids as possible to university, many of whom are not naturally academics, and let's start getting some pride back in the fact that some youngsters want to be engineers, some youngsters want to be skilled, some youngsters want to work with their hands. So competitive energy and a change in education ethos would be two good steps, in my opinion. What say you?
I agree exactly, especially with the university one where everybody thinks everybody's going to go to university, but nobody can really because they're not up to it either. But it was just a way back in the day to get people off the dole figures. Let's send them to university. They're not on the dole figures, are they? And yet people weren't prepared. Every mum and, well, not every mum and dad these days think their little Johnny and little Chloe can go to university. Yeah. Let's get real. They can't.
Do you know what, Steve? It's right for some people. There are some people that absolutely should go to university. There are many others who would have a much more successful life, earn a great deal more money, learning trades and skills. We've got to get that back. Thank you very much indeed. Next up, I've got Raj. Raj, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. I wish you a lot of good health for your oncoming birthday. Hope you help this country now and forever.
It's the earliest happy birthday I've ever had, but thank you.
I do it on the same day as you.
Oh, okay, there you are.
My question is, post-Brexit, what do you think how UK businesses are doing?
Well, look, I think post-Brexit, UK businesses are doing well, despite the fact we've not taken advantage of what Brexit offers us. You know, think of the insurance industry as one massive employer in this country. Every town's got insurance offices. They're not just in London, they're scattered all around the West Midlands and everywhere else. You know, EU regulations making the cost of insurance in this country too high, too bureaucratic, and it's taken now 2 years for this government to even start talking about it. Now, the City Minister, John Glenn, says they're going to look at some of the EU directives on that industry. That's just one little but very specific example of what could be done. The argument is that the government have been consumed by the pandemic, and that has taken up all of their energies. But then there are hundreds of thousands of civil servants working in Whitehall. Well, there were. They've all been at home drinking beer in the garden for the last 2 years, getting full pay. We've just not, this government has not turned its attention to it. And I also think this government doesn't understand small and medium-sized businesses. It just isn't in that mindset. It doesn't realise, running a small business, the amount of time that is taken up with petty regulation that needs to be simplified, if not got rid of, and they're not in that space. So look, I do believe that Brexit, in terms of global trade, has opened us up to the world in a way that wouldn't be possible as EU members. I do believe that Brexit has allowed the government to speak much more strongly on Ukraine that it would have done and could have done as an EU member. It saw a vaccine rollout. The AUKUS deal on nuclear submarines with Australia. There are things that we've done that are good, but in terms of business, I think we've squandered it, Raj. What do you think?
Absolutely, I agree with you. Our trade with European countries have dropped because now they're imposing a 12% duty at the point of export. That was not there. I think we could do much better.
Yeah.
We could do much better.
Yeah, I think, you know what, that is actually the overwhelming feeling of all businesses in this country.
You've been a business person and you can understand. That's the reason I asked this question.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and we need a few more business people on the front bench because we haven't really got any. Thank you very much indeed. Hi. Owen, you're next up.
Good evening, Nigel.
Good evening.
If Russia was to go further and invade a nation such as Poland, would you personally support British troops on the ground?
In that case, I would. I hope and pray that Putin still has some degree of rationality, though I'm not sure, given his behaviour in the last few weeks. One thing for certain, if he was to do that, it wouldn't just be NATO that would fight him tooth and nail, the Poles would fight him tooth and nail. Difficult to think of a European country more embattled over the last 100 years, suffered more than the Poles suffered in the last 100 years. They would not allow this man to walk into their country. And I think militarily, he's clearly stretched much further than he thought he was going to be in Ukraine. And whatever the rights and wrongs of Ukraine as a country, and it's got corruption and all sorts of problems, but you know what? Actually, I think it's quite moving to see these Ukrainian men of all ages, some with no military experience, picking up rifles and defending their homeland. It's what our country used to be like. I hope it still would be today if we faced that. But would you defend NATO?
I would defend NATO.
Yeah, I think actually that's how we all feel. And Putin better know that. It's a shame the American president isn't a bit more prominent in his comments. But never mind. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you. Roger, you're next up. Good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. Welcome to Dudley and welcome to the Black Country.
Thank you very much.
My question for you is, do you think the next generation of MPs will be better or worse than the ones we have now? And I'm being polite.
Well, I think we became consumed, didn't we? Both the main parties became consumed with career politicians.
Yeah.
You know, with people who left Oxford with their degree, went to work in research offices, became members of Parliament in their late 20s, spent their weeks together in Westminster, their weekends together doing whatever they do, appeared to have no hobbies, no life, no interest outside politics, a level of intermarriages that's almost off the charts, and just not representative of society as a whole. I do think that the 2019 intake of Conservative members of Parliament from the so-called red wall seats, and we're kind of talking about that here in many ways, I do actually think there is some encouragement by some of those new Conservative members of Parliament that have gone in. One thinks of Lee Anderson from Ashfield, who I had on the show last week. You know, Lee, a former miner, you know, a guy that really is rooted in his community. So I think it's a little bit better than it was a couple of years ago. It's got a lot further to go. I'd be very happy to see the average age of members of Parliament go up by 10 years and see both parties full of people who served, and whether that's running their own business, being in the army, working for a charity, being a nurse, I don't care what they've done, a Parliament made up of people with real experience of life would be a damn sight better than what we've had for the last 20 years.
Yeah.
Right, I've got time for two more very, very quickly. Elliot, do you have a question for me? Elliot, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. How are you?
Very well.
Good. Acknowledging that the answer ultimately to this eludes anybody, do you feel that Putin's ambitions perhaps surpass that of Ukraine? I'm interested to hear what your...
Well, I mean, I spoke to David Starkey, the historian, about this a couple of weeks ago, and he thinks that Putin has got into his mind this sort of greater, sort of Catherine the Great Russia. And that, of course, would take the Baltic states and much of Poland and would lead, actually, very much back to the question that Owen asked me a moment ago. If he does, he's utterly deluded. And if he really thought Russian tanks were going to be welcomed or garlanded with flowers in western Ukraine, clearly he's been in the ivory tower for far too long. I always thought he was quite a clever, rational player. I think he's got into a war, even as far as he's gone now, he can't possibly win. Because even if he takes it militarily, the resistance will be there for decades and decades to come. So in his own little fantasy, perhaps, but it isn't going to happen. What do you think?
I think with the level of pressure that has been obviously currently exerted upon him, it does leave him in a very difficult position where potentially his demise is inexorable, perhaps, of course.
Yeah, you know, the trouble is, how do they get rid of him? I don't know. Thank you for the question. I'm going to take one last quick one. Chris. We're running short of time, but Chris, far away.
Good evening, Nigel. Welcome to the Black Country.
Thank you.
Now we're out of the EU. Do you think the government should be promoting us for all of us to buy more British products similar to the 60s? I'm back in Britain. What do you think?
Yeah, well, of course, we couldn't do that as EU members. We weren't allowed to do that because that would have been discriminatory against our European friends and neighbours. Look, I think one of the things that's happened with Ukraine is, and we had that debate with Ross a bit earlier on, is the idea that you're self-sufficient, the idea that you do things closer to home, the idea that you're less reliant. And we've got a real problem here. It isn't just energy, it's food, and it's many, many other things. And I actually think, yes, the idea that we do back British businesses, back British goods, try and buy more British products, I'm for it, and I'm guessing you are too.
Definitely. I used to be a sales manager. I always supported Britain. And I think you're the only guy that does support Britain. The Prime Minister, I've never heard him push Britain like you, Nigel.
Well, we'll put some pressure on him and maybe he will.
Thank you.
Right, OK.